I'll show you how I made this barn door style console table, or TV stand, or cabinet, whatever you want to call it. Let's get started. I'm just starting by breaking down a sheet of 3/4 inch alder plywood. My low budget straight edge and circular saw work okay, I guess. And to avoid splintering the thin veneer of the plywood, I first make a cut really shallow and then come back with a second cut all the way through. I'm just cutting to rough dimensions here and to get small enough pieces that I can clean it up on the table saw. This cabinet's my own design. I designed it in SketchUp and then created a cut list and a plan for how to get all the pieces out of a single piece of plywood. With all the panels cut to final size, I'm setting up the table saw to cut the dado slots. It takes quite a few test cuts and adjustment with the shims to get it exactly the right thickness. And also just making sure the height of the cut is right. And after about 30 minutes of setup, the cuts are pretty quick and easy. I'm using a simple jig to drill the shelf pin holes. I covered this in a previous video, so I won't linger on the details here. I cut the horizontal spreaders the right length. I partially assembled the plywood and then just did a couple of cuts to sneak up on the length for the perfect fit. I'm going to use pocket hole screws for the horizontal braces along the top of the cabinet. These will be completely covered and hidden in the final assembly, and they're a pretty easy and effective joinery method. So before assembling it, I cut a rabbet joint around the back edge. This will be for a piece of 1/4 inch plywood backing to the cabinet. And the cabinet is ready to assemble. I'm just using a simple butt joint with some recessed screws for the 2 vertical panels. It's kind of a pain in the butt to get it at just the right spacing. And I'm thinking that's why they call it a butt joint. With the help of some alignment blocks that I made, I glue and screw the horizontal struts in place. And the frame of the cabinet is assembled. After cutting the shelves to final size, I need to add some edge banding to hide the plywood edges. I could have just used that stuffy iron-on, but I didn't have any, and I do have enough scrap wood here to make my own. Making use of a thin rip jig, I'm able to cut 6 pieces all about 1/8 of an inch thick and glue them onto each shelf, and I'm just using some painter's tape here to help keep the glue from soaking into the thin plywood outer veneer. When the glue is dry, a flush trim bit works great to clean up the edges, and the shelves are done. And now on to making the face frame. I'm starting with milling this knotty alder and breaking it down to final dimension. A little bit of rustic feel is good for this cabinet, but some of these pieces have knots that are so big they really aren't even structurally sound, and I have to cut around them. I'm making use of dowels to join the pieces together. Just using a low-budget doweling jig works fine. I just need a little extra help from a flashlight since it's kind of hard for my old man eyes to see the marks. The glue up is simple and easy with the dowels lining everything up for me. I did first size the end grain. That is, I put some glue in all the end grain pieces and let it soak in for about 5 minutes and then put a little more glue on before assembling it. I'm not really sure these corner clamps are needed because all the miter saw cuts are perfectly square, but better safe than sorry. After a little bit of sanding, it's time to glue it onto the cabinet. I want the top of the bottom shelf to be flush with the frame, so I decided to stick on some alignment blocks using double-sided tape. And then I turn the whole thing upside down and let that frame hang off of these alignment blocks. The blue tape is here just to try to keep the glue from smearing into the plywood veneer. After the glue is dry and I take off the smattering of clamps, then I just use a flush trim bit to clean up the edges. I had intentionally made the frame so it would hang over just about 1/16 of an inch on each side, so I wouldn't have to get the alignment perfect on the glue up. Next is to cut the trim for the bottom of the cabinet. I had a lot of questions from the video where I made these joiner table extensions about how long of a workpiece you can run through it. This piece is almost 60 inches long and it worked great. The edge that I jointed here came out perfectly straight down the entire length. Not bad for a benchtop joiner. I'm intentionally leaving some knots. I think it'll go well with this style of furniture, but I do want to fill the cracks. I'm using this Starbond dark brown color CA glue and an accelerator. I'll leave a link in the description for the specific bottle I'm using here. It works really well and so easy to use. It dries almost instantly and you can sand it. On some of the larger cracks, I missed a few spaces and had to go back again, but still it just takes a minute to dry and you're off to the next step. Just using a miter saw to cut the 45-degree miters, and then I trim up the side pieces to the right length. I was about to put a round over on these pieces, and then I realized I screwed up. I should have done this before I cut the 45s. Guess I'll have to do it later after it's all glued up. Yeah, that worked out okay, I guess. Easy mistake to recover from. Making the top of the cabinet from some 6/4 alder, so the final thickness should be just under 1.25 inches. A couple of cleanup passes on the joiner and the edges all fit nice and tight. It's a really straightforward glue up. And while the glue is drying, I also go ahead and fill the knot hole, same as I did earlier with some of this dark brown CA glue. This piece is about 15 inches wide and my planer's only 13 inches, so I need to get out the router sled. Man, this thing has been so nice to have. I'm so happy I added it to my shop last year. I don't want to take off any more thickness than is really needed to get it flat, so I kind of feel around the whole piece to find the lowest spot, and then I set the router depth right at that depth. Each pass just slow and methodical, working my way down the length of the board. The overall process goes pretty fast. Both sides are done in less than an hour, and that includes all of the setup and teardown of the sled itself. These router marks look really bad on camera, but they're really shallow, like you almost can't even feel them. Just a couple of passes with 80 grit sandpaper gets rid of all the router marks. After trimming it up to final size, then I put a 1/4 inch round over along the top edge. I'm going to use this router bit set to make the shaker style doors. I've tried cutting the tongue and groove for this type of door on a table saw before, but it takes quite a bit of setup, and so I just bought this router bit set, try to make it easier. And it's honestly kind of complicated to get all the right spacers in each piece and get what I want, but hopefully once I get it set up, I can reuse the same setup in the future. So after adjusting the height of the bit on the router table, it is really straightforward to just feed all the pieces through to cut the grooves. And I do the top frame pieces the same setting as the side frame pieces. Change the bit used to cut the tongues on the top frame pieces and make sure that the height of the bit is set just right. I decide to line up all the end pieces and tape them together in order to run them through back to back. This should help avoid any tear out and also helps me keep them straight and square as I push them through. And I add a sacrificial piece on the end. Dang, that doesn't look right. How it kind of dropped off the roller right at the end of each board. That little gap is not acceptable to me, and I'm going to have to recut these. The issue is that I didn't have the fence exactly aligned with the roller on the bit, so I go back and make sure it's properly set. Then I have to trim off just about 1/16 of an inch from each door piece and recut the tongues. Then I have to trim off just about 1/16 of an inch from each door piece and recut the tongues. Then I have to trim off just about 1/16 of an inch from each door piece and recut the tongues. Then I have to trim off just about 1/16 of an inch from each door piece and recut the tongues. Then I have to trim off just about 1/16 of an inch from each door piece and recut the tongues. They came out good this time, and it's a good thing on this cabinet the exact door width doesn't matter, plus or minus a 16th of an inch is fine. Otherwise, I would have had to go back and get more wood and start over. To make the center panels, I resaw some alder pieces into some thinner pieces, then I straighten up the edges on the table saw and then glue them up. After the glue is dry, I can run them through the planer to get them down to the exact 1/4 inch thickness that I want for the door center panels. Note that I had some extra length on some of the boards, and by running them through the planer back to back and with the extra length forward and aft, then I avoid getting any snipe marks on the usable part of the workpiece. And then I just cut off those ends when getting it down to final size. By temporarily assembling the doors without the center panel, I'm able to use it as kind of a template to mark the angles that I need for the cross pieces. I was pretty nervous about getting the exact right length and angle for these. This is a step in the project I've been thinking about a lot, like how to calculate the angles. But I tried not to overanalyze this. I just moved the miter saw to match the line and made the cuts. And it worked pretty good. The pieces are just the right length and the angles are correct. Just some glue and some clamps to assemble the basic shaker style door. And then after the glue is dry, I'm trying something new to me. I've seen others do this. It's to use wood glue for the long-term strength and also add some dabs of CA glue so that I can press it down and hold it for just a minute until the CA glue dries. Then that CA glue should kind of act as a clamp until the slower setting wood glue dries. And it seemed to work pretty good. A quick sanding on all the doors to clean up all the joints, and they look great. It's time to put the finish on the cabinet. It's always a really fun part of the project, in my opinion. I did a video recently on how to get a dark stain without blotchiness, and I'm following the process that I outlined in that video. First is to put on a generous coat of shellac, and this will act as a wood grain sealer to help the stain go on more evenly. Then I apply a General Finishes gel stain. Just wipe it on and wipe it off. This project has a lot of nooks and corners to get into, including making sure the shelf pin holes are done. The next is to mix in some dye to the lacquer to make it a tinted lacquer, or some call it a toner. This adds a little more darkness, as well as color and some depth beyond just the gel stain. I'm just comparing to a sample here that I created as a guide to make sure I don't get it too dark. And once it's dark enough, then I just use straight up untinted clear lacquer for the remaining coats. And before the last coat of lacquer, I lightly sand it with 220 sandpaper. And I use a very fine steel wool around the edges, not sandpaper. This is just I don't want to risk sanding through to the bare wood around the corners. The final coat of lacquer is really thin so it'll dry quickly before any more dust settles in it in my dusty shop. I'm attaching the top to the cabinet using these tabletop fasteners. I guess the idea is that these will allow a little bit of natural wood movement over time. The back of the cabinet's a piece of 1/4 inch alder plywood that I just tack on with some brad nails. I bought this barn door hardware kit online. It works pretty good. I'll leave a link to it in the description. I I guess the only complaint I have is that the spacers for the top rail are a little big and it made the door fit a little bit too far away from the cabinet. Here you can see when I test fit it before finishing the cabinet. I wanted a little tighter fit, so I did figure out a way to cut a 1/4 inch off of each spacer. And now you can see it fits much better. Thanks so much for watching, and if you think I've earned it, it'd be great if you hit that thumbs up like button and consider subscribing.